Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in American English Live Teacher Development Series 4. My name is Lauren, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, moderator Kate, who will be serving as moderator to help answer your questions and respond to your comments during the session. Today, our host Kate will unfortunately be unable to serve as our host today, but we are happy to welcome Amy Rich, who will be filling in as host for today's session. Amy will be talking with English language specialist Joe McVeigh about content-based language instruction, CBI, through an examination of methods used to connect and integrate content learning and language instruction. So let's go ahead and get started.
Welcome. As Lauren said, I'm Amy, and I'm part of the American English social media team, and I'm very happy to be your facilitator and host today. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to any first-time viewers and are also very happy to see those of you who have attended previous events. It's great to be with you all. So let's start this AE Live viewing group photo featuring the viewing group from the American Corner, Pristina, Kosovo. We love to see teachers learning and sharing ideas as they view the American English Live series. So please share your photos by emailing them to American English Webinars at elprograms.org or by sharing them on social media. If you do share via social media, make sure to tag us at American English for Educators so we can see the great photos you post. We may even feature one of your photos in the next session. Our presentations for this series are on the topics of increasing learner motivation, content-based instruction, and communicative grammar teaching. Today is our third session in Series 4. If you missed the first two sessions, please see the links to the recordings here in the chat or comment box that the moderators are sharing with you now. Feel free to take a look at the recordings and presentation materials there. So here's a little about what to expect during today's session. Each session is approximately 60 minutes long and is often related to an American English eTeacher massive open online course or Teacher's Corner theme on the American English website. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But we really hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and experiences. Please do share your thoughts using the comments feature or chat box. When our session comes to a close in about an hour, you will have an opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the session, we'll share a link in the comments and at the top of this post. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly. Once you have successfully passed the quiz, you can expect to get your badge by mail from Badger at badger.io in about a week. Finally, before we begin, we'd like to announce our upcoming MOOC, Content-Based Instruction, which is also the topic of today's webinar. The MOOC is designed for teachers who are already teaching or are preparing to teach content-based instruction, or CBI. You might have heard this topic referred to as CLIL, Content and English Integrated Learning, or EMI, English as a Medium of Instruction. Orientation begins on February 11th, and the course officially begins on February 18th, ending on March 25th. Be sure to register now at www.aeteacher.org/facilitated_MOOCs. And now for today's session, implementing content-based language instruction in your classroom. This session will focus on the needs of teachers who are currently using or interested in content-based language instruction, or CBI, in the classroom. Participants will learn basic CBI concepts and examine methods to connect and integrate content learning and language instruction. They will also examine sample materials and consider how best to structure lessons, discuss how to simplify content to make difficult ideas easier to understand, and explore the need for attention to subject-specific vocabulary. And on to a little bit about our presenter, Joe McVeigh. Joe McVeigh teaches at St. Michael's College in Vermont in the northeastern United States. Joe has worked previously at universities in California and overseas. He is the author of several textbooks for students, and he serves on the board of directors of the TESOL International Association. Joe also works as a consultant, advising schools on English language needs and giving professional development workshops. He has worked as an English language specialist for the US Department of State in Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Spain. Next week, he will be traveling to give workshops and conference talks in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Welcome, Joe.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. I'm so happy to be here with everybody. And I'm really excited to be talking about content-based instruction just before we start the MOOC on the same topic. So I really want to encourage our participants who find this interesting to sign up for that much more in-depth talk.
Thanks, Joe.
So our talk today is about implementing content-based instruction in the classroom. And really what we're going to do today is divided into two halves. And the first half, we'll be really looking at content-based instruction. What do we mean by content-based instruction and some other terms that are quite similar? And what are some different models of CBI? And then in the second part of the talk, we'll be looking more specifically at how you could structure a CBI lesson, how you could find source materials, establish objectives, adapt texts, look at key vocabulary terms, develop some tasks, and assess student learning. So Amy, just as we're getting started, let's look at our first really key question. What does content-based instruction mean? And maybe we could ask our participants in the chat box to chime in and see what they think content-based instruction means.
Okay, great. So audience, Joe would like to know what you think content-based instruction means. Let's see here. Okay, Victoria says, CLIL, language is taught through the content. Ming says content comes first. Let's see what else we have here. Does that sound about right, Joe?
Well, that's great. And I'm sure that people are still kind of thinking about this and getting their answers in. I see Yin says subject-based learning, which is another way of saying it. But I'll show you the answer that I came up with that on our next slide, that content-based learning instruction is teaching English and teaching another subject area together in the same course. So this is the really kind of short and easy version of the of what we'll be talking about today. So if content-based language instruction is teaching English and another subject together in the same course, let's turn to another question. What are some possible content areas or subjects then that can be taught in English? And Amy, let's ask our participants again what they think are some possible content areas where they think English could be taught.
Okay, well, we have a couple people saying all subjects, but specifically math, science, STEM, culture, history, technology, all of them seems to be pretty popular.
Well, there certainly are a lot of areas. And Amy, I'm going to play a little game with you in which you stand in for our participants. So what I'm going to do is show you a picture of a content area and you guess the content area. Okay, this is kind of a lightning round, so we'll go sort of fast.
Oh boy.
So here's our first picture. What content area do you think this could be?
Geography?
Geography. I think you're right. Geography. Okay, how about the next one?
Oh, history?
History. That's what I had as well. Though I thought someone might think of something about culture or travel. Okay, I think the next one is easy. Try this one.
Math, algebra?
I had math. I had math, and it's interesting to note there's a difference in American English and British English that we always say math with no S on the end, but in British English they always say maths with an S, but it's the same subject. Okay, the next one.
Oh, well, I mean, it says physics, but it's kind of a little bit of everything.
That was a little bit easy. Yeah, hopefully these pictures represent different aspects of physics. Okay, and here's your last one.
Chemistry?
This is chemistry. Yeah, I hope that the Lego figure there is an accurate representation of what might go on in a chemistry class. So there are a lot of different subject areas that can be taught in English, and we can't, of course, today look at all of those different areas. So that what we'll try to look at are some concepts that could be used no matter what subject you're teaching. So let's look at some different types of content-based instruction. And you might have heard of these different expressions, which are more or less talking about the same thing. So the first one we're looking at is content-based instruction, sometimes called CBI. And then, as Amy said in her introduction, content and language integrated learning, which is sometimes known as CLIL. And another one is English as a medium of instruction, or EMI. And we're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail, but there's a few things that all of these content-based kinds of content-based instruction have in common, that they all have the same goals for their students, as you'll see on our next slide here. So one thing is they all are trying to construct knowledge and develop understanding about a topic and a learning task. So the idea is we're learning about the subject, we're understanding the subject at the same time. Secondly, we're hoping to use language meaningfully and purposefully. You know, sometimes in our English classes, we're just focused on the language and we're looking at the form or the grammar, but we're not really so focused on the meaning. So hopefully through CBI, we're more focused on the meaning. And then we're also hoping to learn about the language in the context of learning through the language. So as we just said, there are some different kinds of content-based language instruction. CBI, content-based instruction, CLIL, content and language integrated learning, EMI, English as a medium of instruction. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. And first, we're going to turn our attention to CBI, or content-based instruction. And Anne Snow in 2014 gave a formal definition of content-based instruction. She said, content-based instruction is the integration of language teaching aims with content instruction. Amy, what do you think the word aims means in this sentence?
Goals, teaching your goals for the class.
Yeah, I think goals here, so that you're trying to, the final purpose of your teaching for language is going to be integrated with the content. So Anne Snow and her colleague Donna Brinton, who are two of the foremost experts on content-based instruction, especially from the US perspective, came up with or explained three separate models of CBI. The first is called sheltered instruction, in which the teacher supports students in a class. The second is theme-based instruction, in which an existing English class focuses on a specific theme or idea. And then the third model that they suggested is adjunct instruction, in which two teachers work together. And this is often in a university setting. So you have one teacher who's focusing on the content part and another teacher who's focusing on the language part.
And can I interject for a second, Joe? Because we're getting a couple questions from our audience, and I want to make sure we give them their opportunity to pose them. So we have a question from Wise KC, who asks, which area is the main focus between content and language?
Ah, that's a great question. So, and we're going to be, I'm going to put off that question, Amy, because we're going to come to that a little bit later. But this is really a very important question. We're talking about content-based instruction. If we're talking about content on the one hand, we're talking about language on the other hand. Should one be more important than the other one? Should they be equal? We're going to look at that.
Well, I have one more question, and I think you could probably answer this one right now.
Okay.
Iram would like to know, what's the difference between content and task-based learning?
Content and task. Well, that's a great question. So when we think about the term content, we're really thinking about the subject area. So earlier, for example, we talked about some possible subject areas like history. And if you thought,
Right.
if you were teaching a class about history, maybe there would be a section of that class where you're looking at a particular historical event. So for example, if you were teaching US history, you might be looking at the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. So that would be the content. The task, on the other hand, is what do you ask the students to do with
Right.
that content information. So for example, the task might be to read an article and answer some questions. The task might be to listen to a lecture and have a discussion. So that's the difference between content on the one hand and task on the other.
Great, thank you. Thanks
Sure.
for clarifying.
Good. Well, let's go on and look at a little bit more detail at the idea of sheltered instruction, which is the first model of CBI. Sheltered instruction is often used in English-speaking countries, and in a sheltered class, this is often used in primary and secondary schools. The second language students are separated from the native English students. Sometimes it's a separate class just for English language learners, and at other times, for example, I live in a part of the United States where there are not very many non-native speakers. Often the non-native speakers will be taken out of the class temporarily and given some extra help by an English teacher who will offer some additional support to help them understand the content of the class. And a popular model here in the United States is called the SIOP model, which stands for Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. So an example of a sheltered class might be a primary school in the United States where the subject matter is science. And the course is entirely in English, but the teacher would very carefully include lessons to make sure that the English learners understand the content. So that would be our first model of sheltered instruction in CBI. The next model that we want to look at is called theme-based instruction. And theme-based instruction is a little bit different in that it's really an English class. And in the English class, the teacher selects themes and topics according to student interests and needs. Now, this could be an entire course in which this theme is being studied, or sometimes there are different units. Maybe there's one segment of the course that would look at one subject and another segment of the course that would look at a different subject. So the teacher would put together some readings, listening material, and other content about the selected theme, and there would be a lot of emphasis on the language skills such as listening, speaking, reading, writing. They'd all be integrated together. So for example, this might be done in a secondary school in Japan in an intermediate level spoken English class, and the teacher chooses a theme to focus on. For example, marriage might be a theme to look at, and would show the students a video of the content. They might do some readings. There would be some small group discussion. Maybe there'd be some role plays around this topic, and then some writing assignments. So that would be an example of theme-based instruction. And Amy, I'd like to show one other interesting example of theme-based instruction.
Okay.
It comes from the English Teaching Forum magazine. And all of our viewers can look at issues of the English Teaching Forum magazine if they go to the American English website. And I think we can put that address up in the chat, and also it'll be there in the end. And this is an article describing a theme-based course put together by Fredrika Stoller, together with Stacy Hauschild and Elena Polchavchenko. And it's a unit about going green, environmental education and language instruction combined together. So this is a very nicely articulated example of a theme-based class.
Just to verify, Saghir wants to verify that a theme means a topic. Is that correct?
Exactly, yes. A theme is a topic. That's exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the last model of content-based instruction that we'll look at is called the adjunct model. This is kind of a higher level model in which a content course and a language course are conducted at the same time. And so one way that this works is the students are attending, say, a university level course in one subject area, and they have two teachers. They have one teacher who works with them on the content and a different teacher who works with them on the language. And then when it comes time for assessment at the end of the course, the content teacher is assessing the content and the language teacher is assessing the language. So an example of an adjunct course might be, for example, at a university in New Zealand where there's an introductory undergraduate level course, excuse me, in sociology, and second language students are joining together with native English speakers, but then they're meeting separately with an English teacher who's going to focus on helping the students understand the course content, the vocabulary, reading lectures, and preparing for writing assignments. So the adjunct model is a good one. It's a little bit expensive, right? Because you have to have two teachers. So this isn't going to work in every context, but it's a great way to help second language students become more familiar with the content. So I see a question asking, is this just for a language class? And the answer is it's actually two classes. The content-based class would be happening anyway. Maybe everybody has to take the introductory class, but maybe not everybody needs the language class.
And we have another question
Sure.
from Salma, who would like to know, can all three models be used at the same time?
Can all three models be used at the same time? I think that would be difficult. And the reason is because I think that these models work a little bit differently depending on the setting. So for instance, sheltered instruction is used much more commonly in primary and secondary schools. The adjunct model is used a lot more commonly at the university level. The theme-based class, I think you probably could use the theme-based model at different levels of instruction, but I don't think it would really work to try to do all of these at the same time. I think you'd have to choose one.
Just choose one. Well, speaking of one of them, the adjunct model, Saima would like to know how much coordination is required to carry out the adjunct model? How much coordination of teachers specifically?
That's an excellent question. And I think any of us who've ever had the chance to work collaboratively with another teacher know that at the beginning, this sounds like a great idea. And then as the course progresses, you find, oh my goodness, I have to spend so much time working with the other teacher to make sure that everything works together. I would, in my experience at a university where this has been used, what we found was that the first time that you teach the class this way, it does require a lot of coordination and collaboration. But if you can take that class and teach it successfully once, then the next times it's not quite so difficult. But yes, it can take quite a bit of time.
Okay. So you said typically, you wouldn't be using these models at the same time, but could you use these three models at various times throughout a course?
Yeah, again, I really think you'd probably want to pick one and see how that goes. I don't think I would try to do, for example, okay, I'm going to do a sheltered model and then move to a theme-based model and then move to an adjunct model. I think that you'd be better off using one of these models at a time.
Okay.
And let's go on and look at some other types of content-based language instruction. So we were looking at CBI and those three possible ways of doing CBI. And now let's take a quick look at content and language integrated learning, which we often abbreviate as CLIL. CLIL is common in primary and secondary schools, and the primary focus in these courses is on the content. Remember, we had that question earlier, is it more language or is it more content? Really, content is king in the CLIL class, and the language learning takes place kind of indirectly. Often CLIL classes are as a result of government policy. For example, they're especially popular in Europe, where the Ministry of Education might say, okay, everybody's going to teach content and language-based instruction now. And a few years ago, I had the chance to travel to Spain and to give some workshops on this subject. And what I found was that sometimes there was an English language teacher who was told, okay, now you're going to teach history. But they didn't have any training or background in history, but suddenly they had to learn about history. But then also it went the other way. They'd find some subject area teachers who were fairly good at English, for example, and they would say, okay, well, now you're going to teach your subject in English. So in that kind of situation, really, somebody has to learn something else. Either the English teacher has to become an expert in the subject, or the subject area teacher has to become an expert in teaching English. But often in the CLIL setting, it's something that's integrated into the educational system, so that when you start out in the lower levels, you're getting only a little bit of language, and most of the content is coming to you in your first language. But then as you progress through the grade levels, you're spending more and more time in English. So an example of this would be at a high school in Spain, and it could be a course in physical education or gym. Well, this is the class where the teacher takes the students outside and they do exercises and activities. And you have to imagine a class like this being taught in English. And in this particular example, the activities would be maybe 60% in English, maybe 40% in Spanish. And so that it's okay to use the second language. You don't have to just use English all the time, but you can help your students with different language terms over the time of the course.
We have an interesting question here from Irum, who asks, what percentage is given to content and language in CLIL?
And that's a good question. In a beginning level CLIL course, you might be let's see. So really, most of the emphasis is on the content. The real emphasis is on the content in CLIL, and the focus on language is almost secondary. So there's a lot more emphasis on the content than on the language.
Okay, excellent. And can CBI and CLIL be applied to all levels? You're talking about like a beginning level here. What about intermediate and upper level students as well?
Yeah, I think CLIL is more commonly taught to students who already have some understanding of the topic. So it's probably not used so much with very, very beginning students, but more likely with intermediate and advanced students, or at least low intermediate.
Okay.
Let's look at one last model of content-based instruction, which is called English as a medium of instruction. This is common at university levels, and with English as a medium of instruction, the focus is almost completely on the content, which is delivered in the second language, probably English in this case. And it's very, very intensive exposure to the second language, but there might not be explicit language instruction. So an example of this might be a university in Saudi Arabia, where students are taking graduate level courses in law, and everything is in English. The books are in English, the lectures are in English, the students have to write in English, the exams are in English, and there's not a lot of support for the language, because the assumption is, and this assumption is not always correct, that the students are coming into the course already having had a lot of language instruction. So that's our last model, English as a medium of instruction. So let's just do a quick review, okay, of models of CBI. So first of all, we looked at content-based instruction, and we looked at 3 different models of content-based instruction, which were sheltered instruction, theme-based instruction, and the adjunct model. Then we looked at content and language integrated learning, and then we looked at English as a medium of instruction. So here's a question. Of these different types of content-based instruction, which one do you think students would get the most English in?
Okay, audience, Joe would like to know which of these models you think students would get the most exposure to English in. So, well, we're getting everything.
Wow.
EMI seems popular at the moment, but it could change.
Okay, so I see a lot of different answers here, but the answer is most likely English as a medium of instruction, because
And
that
why is that?
well, that's because with English as a medium of instruction, everything is in English, and there's no focus at all on the second language. There's very little language support. So a student taking a course with English as a medium of instruction would probably be experiencing a lot more English than anybody in any of these other models.
Great. And before you move forward, we just have a clarifying question from Kubo, who asks, why is it so important to focus on content instead of language? How does this work? What's,
So I think maybe Kubo's question is, what is the advantage? Why would we even want to do this? Right. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One reason is that I would say it's a question of efficiency, that there are many countries which say, our students have a limited amount of time in the classroom. We'd like them to be able to learn about these different subjects. Let's put language and content together and hope that they will learn faster. It might be a question of motivation. There are always those students who come to English class, but they're not really very interested in English, and you have to really convince them of its importance, but maybe they are more interested in another subject. And the other idea is that often, in our English classes, what's the subject of English? What are we teaching in terms of the language? Well, maybe we're teaching grammatical forms, or we're teaching vocabulary. And sometimes we're teaching those things, we might use the expression, out of context. We're just kind of teaching them randomly. So one of the advantages of a content-based course is that it kind of organizes that material.
Great answers.
So as we said at the beginning, there's all of these different types of content-based instruction have the same goals for students. Remember, those are to construct knowledge and develop understanding about the topic and the task, to use language meaningfully and purposefully, and to learn about language in the context of learning through language. But I'm talking about this in very general terms, and it's very important that you should consider your own school context, because each of you is teaching in a different setting. Maybe some of you are teaching in elementary schools, some of you are teaching in university classrooms. And Amy, I wonder if we could ask our participants just to very quickly, in a word or two, tell us where are they teaching and in what kind of a setting. So what country are you in? Are you teaching elementary school students or secondary students or adults? And just so we can get a feeling for who's out there.
All right, audience, where are you teaching and who are you teaching? All right, China, Japan, Pakistan, Ukraine, Bahrain. Derek from Bahrain is teaching secondary school. Rosella is teaching primary school in the Philippines. Everyone's answering so quickly, it's hard to catch these.
Wow, I see Thailand, Pakistan, Kazakhstan,
Turkey, Maldives,
Iraq. Wow, that's great. That's great. And I saw someone was teaching in an art college as well, Uzbekistan. Well, this is terrific. So what I think I want you all to remember is that as we're talking today about content-based instruction, you need to take the ideas that I'm sharing with you and think about how they would work in your classroom. How can you take these ideas and make them work for you? And so one of the first questions we need to consider is the one of balancing language and content, a question that came up a little bit earlier. Okay, if it's a language class and a content class, do I give more emphasis to one or the other? Well, one way to think about balancing language and content is to think of them on a continuum. What do I mean by a continuum? A continuum is kind of like a long line where maybe on the one hand, there's a lot of focus on the content, and on the other hand, there's a lot of focus on language. So where do we come down in our course? Should there be more focus on one or the other? Well, there's no one correct answer to this. Again, it's going to depend on your context and on your situation. But let's look at what a language-driven or a content-driven course would look like. In a language-driven course, the content is used primarily to learn the second language. In other words, our focus is more on language. Whereas in the content-driven course, we're really focusing more on the content and we're using the language to learn the content. In the language-driven course, the language learning is most important. That has the priority. However, in a more content-driven course, the content learning has priority. So in the language-driven course, the content learning is kind of incidental. Okay, well, if you learn something about the content, it's all right, but it's not the most important thing. Whereas if we're more in a content-driven course, then language learning is really going to be secondary. So you can get a feeling for how a course which is more language-driven or more content-driven might work. The objectives would be different. The way that the curriculum is put together might be different. And the way that we would assess our students would also be different. So in a language-driven course, we might expect the assessment to be more about, has the student learned the language? Whereas if the emphasis is more on content, we might expect the students to be evaluated more on their mastery of the content. So I know this might be a little bit confusing because I can hear already in my ears some teachers saying, but what should I do? Which is most important? And I can't tell you because it depends on your own situation. Probably I would think if you're just starting off with a content-based instruction and you're an English teacher, probably you're gonna make your class a little bit more language-driven. But maybe you're one of those teachers who is an expert in a subject matter area and now you're teaching English, maybe you're going to focus more on the content. Both are possible. Anywhere along that continuum is possible. And all of them are okay as long as your students are learning. So Amy, let's move on. And in that first half of the talk today, we're looking at different models of CBI. And what I'd like to do now is to turn our attention to planning and structuring lessons. So supposing you're a teacher and you want to teach a lesson that's a content-based class. So the first thing that you want to do in terms of structuring your lesson is you're going to want to find some source material. You're going to want to establish some content objectives. You're going to want to establish some language objectives. You're probably going to want to choose a text and adapt that. You're going to need to determine some key vocabulary. You need to develop some tasks to make sure that the students understand the content and then assess student learning. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at each one of these parts of structuring a lesson. So the first thing that you need to do is to find source material. Well, where are you going to find source material?
What do you mean by source material before you get started there?
Sure. So let's think of an example, Amy. What would be a good example of a particular kind of content?
Let's ask our audience.
Well, I mean, let's just take one. Let's say it's going to be physics. And so let's say that you're going to teach a content-based course on physics, but you're an English teacher. All of your textbooks are about English. You're going to need to find some materials that talk about physics. So by a source material, I mean some material that you can use and probably adapt to use in your class. Now, if you're very, very lucky, you might have a specially an English language text in the subject area. But you'd be very lucky if you had that. So maybe you need to go to the content-based teachers in your school and get some of their materials. Maybe you need to go to the library so that you might want to find a book about that. Or alternatively, you might want to go online and see if you could find any materials online in English that would help you. And that's what I did. And take a look at this picture and guess if you can see if you can guess where I got some material from.
Did you get it from NASA's website?
Excellent. Yes, I got it from NASA. NASA are the National Space Agency. And as you can see on the next slide, I went to their website and I found that not only do they talk about space, but they have a lot of information about things like precipitation and the weather. And so what I did was I went to their website, and all of these materials are free, by the way, and I found an interesting unit on the water cycle. Well, I need to remind you of what the water cycle is in case it's been a while since you studied that. So take a look at this picture, and I think this will remind you of what the water cycle looks like. That's where,
oh yes.
Does this look familiar? So
it's all coming back, yes.
It's okay. So, you know, water comes out of the ocean and evaporates, and it goes up into clouds, and then it falls to the earth in precipitation and goes into the ground. So that's the water cycle. So you're going to first of all locate that source material, and then as we look at the next step in structuring lessons, the next step is going to be we need to establish some objectives, and we need to establish some objectives for content and some objectives for language. Well, when we talk about establishing objectives, we have to ask ourselves, what is the target? What do we mean when we say establishing objectives? Well, another word for objectives would be aims. Another word for objectives would be goals. We want to ask ourselves a different question, and that question is, what do I want the students to be able to do as the result of the instruction? Sometimes we use the term student learning outcomes in terms of objectives. And what we want to do is to say, at the end of the class, I would like the students to be able to do a few different things. So let's say I took that subject area of the water cycle and I wanted to establish some objectives. So we're going to have some objectives, first of all, for the content. So what might I want my students to be able to do as a result of that instruction in terms of the content? Let's ask our participants what they think.
Do you mean related to the water cycle?
So I mean related to the water cycle. If that's the content, what do we want the students to be able to do in terms of the content?
Okay, so Anu says to learn about the process of the water cycle, to be able to identify what the water cycle is, to understand the ecosystem, learn the process, learn how it works, describe how it works. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. Well, what I said was one thing that they would want to do would be able to describe the water cycle, maybe explain how evaporation works, maybe give examples of different kinds of precipitation. So those would be some of the content objectives we might consider. What about language objectives? For the language objectives, we might want to say students will be able to do something related to language. What might some of those objectives be?
So what might some language objectives be, audience? Let's see here. Know terminology, such as what? What are some water cycle terms? Surely somebody knows some. Describing the water cycle, vocabulary, terms related to water, precipitation. There's a good one. Yeah, I think learn vocabulary seems to be a popular response here.
Okay, well, what I said was some things that they might want them to do is to define 3 key vocabulary terms, use the simple present tense correctly in a spoken explanation, and write a well-structured paragraph. Well, we could have another entire webinar on writing student learning outcomes and objectives, but I did want to say to the audience, when you're writing these, there are a few terms that you probably don't want to use. And one of those terms is learn, and one is understand, and one is know. And the reason is because it's very difficult to assess that. How do you assess if a student knows something or learns something or understands something? Whereas if you use a nice hard verb like define or explain or describe, it's easier then when it comes to the assessment part of your unit to see if you've been able to do what you wanted to do.
Right, and our audience is saying you can measure that.
Exactly, that's it. We want to be able to measure it. So the next phase in structuring a lesson would be to adapt the text, because frequently what happens in a content-based course is that you get a source material or text, but maybe it's too difficult or too complicated for your students. You might need to simplify it in some way. So take a look at this text, which I got from the NASA website. It's the beginning of their article about the water cycle. Now, if you looked at this text, I think you might find some words there that would be difficult for your students to understand. What words do you think might be challenging here?
Ooh, we have a hydrological cycle.
Hydrological cycle, yeah.
Do you think, audience? Evaporation, condensation, sustain. Okay, great answers. Abundance.
Right.
How do those sound, Joe?
There are quite a lot there, and I think as teachers we usually have a pretty good sense of what vocabulary words are going to be challenging for our students. If you ever want to check to see if you're right, take a look at a website that you can see listed at the bottom of this slide. It's the Vocabulary Profiler at the University of Hong Kong, and what you can do there is that you take a text that you have in a digital form, you copy and paste it into their analyzer, and it will tell them which of the words you have are very common, the words in red in the top 1,000 words in English, the words in green, which are in the top 2,000 words in English, some words that might be on an academic word list, or some more difficult words. So you could imagine that probably those words in black and maybe the words in blue are going to be the most difficult ones that you might want to help your students with.
Wow, how helpful is this? Wonderful.
So let me show you another picture, Amy. And what does this picture look like to you?
Well, cut to the chase, perhaps some scaffolding.
Yeah, this picture is a scaffold, and a scaffold is the structure that we use when we're constructing or making a building. And we use this term in language teaching to mean it's a method of simplifying the content. And so what we mean by scaffolding is really supporting the language learner in different ways. So for example, we might explain vocabulary to them, use graphs or charts or diagrams or pictures or graphic organizers. We might want to limit the amount of new information that is introduced to students so that they can understand things better. So what are some other methods that we can use for simplifying content? We want to change that content so it's easier. So maybe we would rewrite the text so it uses easier vocabulary and it's simple. Or maybe we would provide some explanations of key concepts in simple English or in the first language. If we're using audio material, we might re-record it to be slower and a little bit clearer, or just generally introduce the content more slowly, or perhaps provide some subtitles for videos so that our students can come to terms with the content a little bit more easily. So the next step in structuring our lessons is to determine the key vocabulary that is needed in our classes. So here's my next question, Amy. Which do you think is more important, grammar or vocabulary? And this is a question for our audience.
Audience, thoughts? Vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. Both of them. Only one person has said grammar so far. What do you think, Joe?
Well, I think I kind of gave it away by my introduction of vocabulary, but
yeah, perhaps.
take a look at this paragraph. I've taken a paragraph from a reading passage, and I've taken out some of the important vocabulary words. So if we read this together, what is this paragraph about? What is the content of the paragraph?
Do you think, audience? Victoria says verbs. We've got vocabulary, learning,
Yes.
world.
So my question to the group is what is the topic of this reading?
What's the topic?
What is the topic? What is the subject about? And I think it's a little bit difficult to understand what this is about. Now, let me show you the same paragraph, but in this next paragraph, I've taken out, instead of the vocabulary words, I've taken out some of the grammar words. See if you can look at it now and tell what the subject matter is.
We're getting lots of color and culture.
Yeah, it's about culture and it's about colors. And so if you look at the entire paragraph together, and I put back all of the missing words, then I think you can see exactly what the paragraph is about on the next page.
Yes, we've got a very smart audience.
Yeah, so here you could figure it out. So if I remove the vocabulary, it's very, very hard to say what it's about. If I take out some of the grammar terms, you can still get it. So vocabulary is very important. So if we go back and look at that first graphic that I showed you about the water cycle, you can see here there's some very key vocabulary words here, right? Evaporation would be one. Condensation would be another. Transpiration, very unusual word, when the water leaves the plants and goes up into the atmosphere. Precipitation, all very key vocabulary words. So those are words that I would probably want to focus on if I were teaching this unit to my students. Now, this picture of the water cycle is a fairly simple picture. If you look at the next image, you'll find that this one has the same idea, but it's a lot more complicated.
Yes, wow.
So maybe I would use that first image for younger students, but if I were teaching a college or university level course, this would be much, much more complicated. And as a result, there might be more vocabulary words that would be key.
And would you maybe, if you had a mixed ability class, use both of these graphics and maybe one of them with the weaker group?
That's a great question. What would you do if you had a class where some students were at a more basic level and some had a better ability in English? Yeah, I think that would be great to try to use both of these materials together, because really, again, what we're looking at here is the content, not just the language. So maybe the more advanced students would be able to appreciate something more in the way of content like this.
Great.
So our next step in structuring our lesson is to develop some tasks to help students understand the content. And so how are we going to develop tasks to help students understand the content? Well, first of all, what we could do would be to modify the tasks so that they're appropriate for your students. So for example, we might try activating the background knowledge of the students. We sometimes use the term schema to help students understand what they already know about the subject area. We talked about teaching unfamiliar vocabulary words and introducing the content by reading or listening or video. Scaffold student understandings with illustrations, graphs, diagrams, and then we want to give students opportunities to use the new language. Well, what are some different ways that we could do these things with our students? Well, one idea that I find useful in this kind of context is small group activities. Because when you're teaching the whole class together, you're standing in the front and you're the teacher, and only one person is talking and everybody else is listening. And if one of your goals for the language part of your class is spoken English, by breaking the class into smaller groups and having small group activities, you can give students more of an opportunity to speak and to listen to each other. Another type of activity that you can use, and this is more likely in, for example, a science-based course, is maybe there's some lab work, or perhaps there are some experiments that students would do, and they would do those with the content, but perhaps they would write up the results in English at the end of it. Another way to involve students in tasks is to try to get them doing things which are a little bit more visual. You know that some students are more visual learners and others are better with words. So you could get your students to illustrate the topic by perhaps cutting pictures out of magazines or finding them online or drawing them and presenting them in a kind of a visual way, for example, on a poster that they would then share with other students in the class or with their instructor. Of course, as English language teachers, we're always interested in having our students do some writing activities, and these can vary tremendously depending on the content area that you're dealing with. So these are some different possible tasks that you could do with your students. And one thing that you want to think about as you're putting these tasks together is, how are you going to sequence them? How are you going to put them in order so that your students are making progress, so that they're kind of starting here with a little bit of knowledge, and then you're gradually building on what they already know from one thing to another. So think a little bit, if you're going to do a variety of different tasks, how are you going to start out? How are you then going to make things a little bit more difficult, so that by the end of the unit that you're working with, students will have a better sense of what they've accomplished. Let me talk also a little bit about the last aspect of structuring lessons, which has to do with assessing student learning. Of course,
happy you're saying that, because a lot of our audience is asking about assessment right now.
Great. Well, when we talk about assessing student work, we're really talking about measuring learning. So early on, when we were talking, we talked a little bit about the content learning part and the language learning part. So then a question that we have to ask when it comes to assessment is this: are we assessing language, or are we assessing content, or are we assessing both? Well, I think the question of which we're assessing really is going to depend on your course. If your course is trying to teach language and content, hopefully it's going to assess both language and content. And one way that you can assess both language and content is through a series of rubrics. And a rubric is a kind of a table where you would say what you wanted students to be able to do with the language, and then what you wanted students to be able to do with the content. If, for example, you have the adjunct model where you had one teacher doing the content and one doing the language, maybe one would focus more on one and another on the other. Another aspect of student assessment is to ask ourselves if the assessment will be formative or summative. And I heard an interesting illustration of the idea of formative or summative assessment. And that idea was this: imagine that you are a chef and you are cooking you're cooking some soup. What you can imagine, as you can see in this picture, you can imagine that if you're going to make the soup, you're going to taste the soup while you're cooking it to see how it tastes. And then in the end, you're going to serve that soup to your guests to see for their enjoyment. So when you're the one who's tasting the soup, it's not really finished yet. You're just kind of doing that in partway through, but at the end, when the guests have the soup, that's the summative assessment. So we want probably to make sure that our students are learning during the process, and then at the end of the process to have some summative assessment. We want to be able to know what our students are doing. So on the next slide, I'll show you one very simple type of assessment that we might use. Earlier on, we looked at some of the vocabulary in the water cycle. So I might want to see, have my students understood or learned the vocabulary for the water cycle? Amy, can you remember these key terms? What do we call it when the water comes from the oceans, lakes, and streams? I'm putting you on the spot here.
Precipitation?
Precipitation.
Condensation?
Usually we're going to use the word here, evaporation, I think.
Oh,
right?
Yes.
Right. And then we'd say condensation is when the water gathers in the sky, and then when it comes back down to the ground on the far side, that would be precipitation. So that would be a kind of an easy way to look at the language part. And then for the content part, you might ask students to explain this. So you might ask them to do that through writing activities. Maybe they would have to write down their explanation of how the water cycle worked, or perhaps another popular way of having students demonstrate their knowledge is through oral presentations, where you would ask individual students or perhaps groups of students to come to the front of the class and to explain what they were doing. So those are a few different ways in which you might help your students to assess the language and content. So I think in the end, what we need to do is we want to put it all together. We want to take all of those different models of content-based instruction to find one that would work for you in your setting. Don't try to use them all at the same time, but find one that would work for you. And then as you structure your lesson, find some materials, set your objectives, adapt your materials, develop some tasks, and then finally you're going to assess the outcome. So I think, Amy, I'll say thank you very much to everyone for coming and attending the webinar today. And also I have just a handful of references, things that I found useful when I was putting the talk together today, that are listed on the next page there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Joe, for helping us all gain a better understanding of how we can connect and integrate content learning and language instruction in our own English language classrooms. We'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your lively engagement and participation today. We hope you'll continue to share your ideas through social media